China.
All right, so sir, should we start?
Yes, let me make sure I'm on the screen. Just give me 1 second. I'm just trying to print something out that I need
Okay.
for this.
Okay.
And then make sure because I don't see my Zoom. You see me, right? You see me fine, right?
We can see you and we can hear you clearly.
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right, hold on a second. Let me just close this out. I'm trying to find, I can't find my Zoom thing. I don't see it. Oh, yeah, oh, there you are. Okay, good, perfect, perfect.
All right, so just before we start, sir, just a formal introduction that is necessary here. So,
Sure.
good evening, everyone, for those who are in South Asia, and good morning, those who are near the US, I guess. So, we have Professor Mark Meirowitz. Sir specializes in Turkish foreign policy, US-Turkish relations, and Turkish-Israel relations, as well as American history, American foreign policy, and constitutional law. Sir has completed Sunny Levin Fellowship, during which he taught English conversation to Turkish faculty while in residence at Istanbul Technical University. He teaches a wide variety of classes at Maritime University, including American history, American foreign policy, constitutional law, and English, and developed a graduate course on the ocean politics and law. Uh, so frequently appears in the US and Turkish media as an expert on the issue related to Turkish politics and American foreign policy. And he is also writing a book on the Turkish foreign policy for the Thearchical Press. So he has been a panelist and moderator at numerous conferences, including IPEC National Conference, the Turkey Focus Group of the National Defense University, Institute of National Security Studies, and at the annual conference of the Transatlantic Studies Association. So with this, sir, most welcome once again, and we are excited to hear you. So I think over to you, sir.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For me, it's early in the morning, and I wanted to extend first my deepest thanks to Imran and to the Indian Society for Legal Research for the privilege of doing this. Now, I see this more as very interactive, so I hope the chat box will light up with questions and comments and ideas. I mean, I'm going to throw out some ideas that I have about this, but I'd be interested certainly in hearing what everybody thinks. So I think the topic really is all about the impact of COVID-19 on international institutions, on international law, on society, and to try to gauge that. So I divided up, I think, into a few parts. The first part, I'm going to look at the international institutions and see how they've been affected by the COVID-19. But I'm also very interested in looking at the rule of law and institutions, particularly in the United States, where we've been somewhat buffeted and challenged by all sorts of some very new and obscure and somewhat bizarre challenges to our institutional structure as well. And I think this has happened generally in many countries around the world. I mean, these momentous events of COVID-19 have changed everything. And the question we have really, number one, is where do we end up after we come out of COVID? Do we come doing business as usual, or are we going to come up with something different? One of the great disappointments, I think, that I have seen is the failure, and I'm very candid, I'm an American, so I'm candid, the failure of its international institutions to cope and address these very difficult challenges that the world has faced. Now, taking, for example, the United Nations and looking at that institution a bit, the United Nations was forged and formed after World War II, and it was formed by the great powers after World War II. And now we are in the 21st century, and the question really is the United Nations really structured in a way that will address properly the events and that are facing us right now. And that's really quite questionable. The Secretary General of the United Nations called for a world global ceasefire. And guess what? Nobody paid attention. I think the only one who paid attention was Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen, and the Houthis said no. So that was the end of that. Now that is a wake-up call. I actually asked this question on another webinar to one of the high undersecretaries in the UN, and their concern was that if we're going to restructure the UN, we shouldn't do it in a disruptive fashion. But you know, all these years have gone by, and the UN has made itself really irrelevant. I have to say that. I mean, this coming from someone who was vice president of the UN Association of New York, an active and a proponent of the UN, it's quite hurtful and deeply shocking when the Secretary General in a good offices says, would you please calm down and stop fighting these wars? We should fight COVID together. And the world is not going to stop, and they're not going to stop the bloodshed and the killing in order to do that. Now, I just wanted to say that we have to understand the United Nations. This is a fundamental principle. And I learned this in graduate school from my mentor for my dissertation. And he said to me, Mark, the great powers can never be challenged. The purpose of the UN is not to challenge the great powers. Therefore, and there would be no UN if the great powers would not have the veto. I understand that. But if we look at some of the recent developments, particularly not just on COVID, but if you take, for example, the WHO as an important institution in global health, has really been weakened substantially by the influence of China over the WHO. And need I say, in terms of China's aggression in India and the Galwan Valley, need I say that China's rise shows us is a wake-up call for the need to develop very viable and robust international institutions that can deal with these crises. Now on COVID, that's a whole other, I think, another presentation on the law and COVID, but the problem is that the WHO became captured, an orphan child of China, and therefore the United States pulled out of it, which in my humble opinion, is maybe not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is to stay in and try to hold on. After all, it's the United States. This is not a minor country. The United States, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, in terms of the need for the international order being an American liberal order, that is the key to stability in the world. What we found is that the international institutions, which should be out there solving problems like this, whether it's trade, WTO, health, WHO, or human rights, UN Human Rights Commission. There was an article recently, I think in one of the journals, talking about China's imperative to become the controlling party in all of the international institutions, including the specialized agencies. This is not a way forward for the world. This is not a way forward for the world. The purpose of these institutions principally is to try to maintain collective security and world stability. In that respect, the UN has been a failure. Irrelevant. It doesn't have a place in international organization, international politics, because it's made itself irrelevant. If the Secretary General says to have a global ceasefire and nobody pays attention, doesn't that show you its irrelevance? Now, what do we do about it? Well, what we need to do about it is a reset or reevaluation of the structure of the UN. Now, the other one that was very interesting on this panel I was on was the OSCE. And this is very interesting. The OSCE is the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. This is a multilateral organization. And can you imagine that anytime they take a decision, all 57 member states have to agree? Let me ask you something. Do you belong to any clubs? Do you belong to any, even your family? You want to make a decision what to have for dinner. Everybody doesn't agree. They need 57 states to agree to do anything. Do you understand what this means? This means they can do nothing. They will do nothing. This means they are pointless. And if you look at the activities of the OSCE, Ukraine, Crimea, I mean, honestly, like I'm a professor, I would give them an F. I'm sorry, I'd give them an E. I give them an I for improvement shown and extraordinary effort, but an F for performance, because they haven't performed. All they do is issue press releases. I'm not trying to be overly critical. I'm just trying to be realistic. in terms of these institutions, which should have been helping us with COVID, instead have been hampering us. So what did we end up with? Nationalism, national solutions. Now, Condoleezza Rice, our former Secretary of State, was interviewed and said, and I think it was right. She said, right now, in the COVID, we're going to focus on our national issues, of course. No question. Each state, each country, each leader is trying to help the people in that country to get through this terrible situation. No question about it. But once we're done with that, we need to kind of figure out what we're going to do going forward. And as I said before, we're going to just do the same thing that we did before. Now, from a conceptual point of view, there have been a lot of disagreements among, let's say, the pundits or the experts. And Henry Kissinger was of the view that the COVID-19 pandemic will alter the world order forever. I'm paraphrasing what he says. He says this is a sea change. This is a major development in world history and world developments. The pandemic will forever alter the world order, he says. He says that the virus's society-dissolving effects do not recognize borders. No country can overcome the virus in a national effort, says Kissinger. He's right. So that we needed global collaborative efforts in order to do this, and we haven't seen it. And I think also Condoleezza Rice, as I mentioned before, former Secretary of State, said that the COVID-19 epidemic shows the triumph of sovereignty. Now, it would be very appropriate to say a few words about sovereignty, because sovereignty is the main stumbling block to international cooperation, international law, and the enforcement of international norms. Now, to return for a moment to the international institutions that I talked about, I mean, it is a bit, I would say, bizarre or peculiar that Iran is on the UN Human Rights Council or Commission or whatever it's called. Iran is on the Human Rights Council. I mean, in other words, what we're finding is that these institutions become, the instruments of national political power, and that's what they're not. Well, yes, it's what my mentor told me is correct. The great powers can't be challenged. I get it, but you're going to have to figure something out that's going to be a little bit better. Because if you're going to have hacking across borders by Russia, you're going to have China's rise. And also China's actions in the world, you're going to have to ask yourself this question. When we come out of this pandemic, what's the world order going to look like, right? Is the world order going to be an American world order with its allies maintaining stability in the world? Or is it going to be a Chinese world order or a Russian world order? This is the choice the world has right now. I think that many of the nations around the world have seen the emptiness of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the debt trap that many countries have fallen into. And this is not about China-US relations or China in the world, but this is a fundamental question. When we come out of the pandemic, says one pundit in an interesting foreign policy magazine debate, which you might want to read, he says the world is going to be more China-centric after the pandemic. And that I am very fearful about because, yes, the United States must engage with China. The United States be peaceful with China and do trade with China, but it has to be on a level where there is a international, legal, liberal world order in which there are norms of behavior that are acceptable to people, and a standard and norms in international law. And this is the whole question about respect for institutions that I think is also very, very important. In other words, what we've seen is a diminution in respect for institutions. In other words, we used to, maybe Americans, I don't know, around the world, I suppose people are always skeptical about government. But people often believe that the government will help them. I mean, at least in the American system, we look to the government to provide us with services, to provide us with assistance in an epidemic, to provide us with help, provide us with support. And what we found, just kind of segueing for a moment from the global institutions, where it's a lack of faith in those institutions, we find nationally around the world that people are losing faith in their own national institutions. And again, I certainly can't speak for India. It was a very complex politics. But as far as America is concerned, and certainly Britain, if you look around the world, and by the way, let me just go back for a moment. look at the way the world system is structured right now, and look at the big players in the world. Very important to see that the big players in the world of the time of the UN are no longer the big players in the world. For example, Great Britain, which used to be the great power in the world, right? And people in India will remember that Great Britain's colonial involvement in India. The sun never sets on the British Empire today. Britain is a mere shadow of what it was before. So it's not a major player anymore in various disputes that it could settle. The EU is in turmoil with Brexit, and when it's looking around to put sanctions on Turkey and all sorts of things that it's doing, it loses its, let us say, its neutrality when it becomes involved in these disputes, and particularly on Cyprus. So EU is not really there to do the job. So you don't have, Great Britain and the Commonwealth. Doesn't have that influence anymore. You don't have the EU, NATO, which was set up to be an element or an instrument of collective security. Really, if you think about it, I mean, it's there, but does it do anything? I mean, I'm not being highly critical of it. I mean, certainly it's important in concept, but is it really available to solve the problems of the world, and particularly deal with Russia and its actions? So all these institutions that we develop are problematic, and internally in our societies, our institutions that we created are also not functioning as optimally as they should. In America, we certainly have gone through a very confusing period with presidential leadership being absent. Again, this is my own personal opinion, in terms of presidential confusion between our presidential leadership and our states telling one thing, federal government saying another thing, and confusion. And then, of course, we had an election, as you hopefully have followed it, but our election in November, where our president says he didn't lose. He still says he won, even though the institution of the Electoral College, flawed as it may be, and maybe you don't know the intricacies of it, but it's quite intricate, quite complex, it's criticized all the time, but it's been working since we began the Republic in the 18th century. Yet people today, the Electoral College cast its votes, but yet the president says, I didn't lose, I won. So we live not only in a world of a lack of faith in institutions, right, but also a world of confusion, where the press is deemed to be the enemy of the people, and there's all this fake news allegedly out there, so we don't even know what's true. So we actually have in America a whole debate about, of course, whether people should follow distancing rules and should follow the masks and all of that. And now with the vaccine, we have a big movement, and probably this is around the world. People don't want to take the vaccine because they're concerned about it, and conspiracy theories. This is this is exacerbated, I'm sure, by social media, in the sense that these ideas are able to go viral, if you will, on the social media. But still, in terms of creating a viable national society in your own jurisdiction, problematic. To create a global society, very problematic. Now, I wanted to just quote, because I was Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison referenced this particular book in a lecture that he gave, a webinar recently, and I think it's worth referring to. In other words, what are we looking forward to in terms of how the world should be shaped, and what should we be doing going forward? This is a book by Hedley Bull called The Thearchical Society, A Study of Order in World Politics. And this is where I go back again to how do we fashion a world order. According to Kissinger, this is a pivotal event in world history. According to Richard Haas of Foreign Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, there's nothing different here. It's just going to accelerate these developments, and we're just going to be doing more of usual. But again, the institutions like the UN are not well formed to address these issues. I did say just for a moment about the veto. I mean, the veto was the reason why the great powers joined. But the veto is the, if you will, Achilles heel of the UN system, in the sense that you can't really accomplish any action against a great power when great powers rise and challenge others on a basis which may not be within the norms of international world order, what can the UN do? Well, we can sit there and criticize, we can take votes. Peacekeeping has been marginally effective, but in cases where, for example, in the Arab-Israeli war, where the UN just agreed to withdraw the peacekeeping troops, that can actually promote world conflict and not stop it. Or you can call for disarmament that can have a tremendous policy effect. On to Hedley Bull, he says as follows: a society of states or international society exists when a group of states conscious of certain common interests and common values form a society in the sense that they conceive themselves bound by a common set of rules in their relations with one another and share in the working of common institutions. I'm going to read it again because it is really important. What is a society of states? What is an international society? A group of states conscious of certain common interests and common values form a society in the sense that they conceive themselves to be bound by a common set of rules in their relations with one another and share in the working of common institutions. This has everything, really. It's really important. What are we talking about? Well, we need to develop or have a society of states with common set of rules with their relations with one another. That is woefully absent in our international world order today. In other words, what we have many countries which promote the liberal world order, but others that do not and want to subvert it or interfere with it. And the problem is we need to develop that. Now, if we can't develop it in an international institution, then we need to develop it in a multilateral sense, which means that this idea of the Trump doctrine that President Trump advanced, which is isolationism of the United States, is gone. It's finished. I mean, it can't continue. You can't have a world with rising China, rising Russia, where the United States is going to be an isolationist state. It needs to join with its allies, and that would be India and Japan and Australia and other countries that have this idea of a common set of rules and behavior, and that they can work together to develop this liberal world order which we seek. And that way we will be able to deal with the challenges that are coming up, not to sit at the UN, which becomes meaningless, and just debate and vote and then pass resolutions which are not implemented because states work together to interfere with those resolutions and don't follow those norms. Again, what Hedley Bull is talking about is a commonality of norms and values, and that we have to insist on. And what we should do is restructure the international institutions, and if there are states that don't follow those international norms and values, then those states should not be participants. This idea that we need everybody to be in there, but then use those institutions as a modality for the purpose of advancing national interest, that is not the purpose of the United Nations. It wasn't the purpose of it after World War II. But again, World War II is over. It's been over for a long time. It was appropriate at the time following World War II to create the United Nations. Now, about law, I was thinking also, because the title of this very nice conference is Law and the Courts. And I think that, I mean, as far as an American lawyer, I think that, I think this has been this has buffeted and really been a shocking blow to the legal system as well. On the other hand, because in terms of the functioning of the courts in the pandemic, that is certainly a challenge. But I think that the report card on the American legal institutions has been very, very good, because we see that our legal institutions continue to function. We see that the Supreme Court, which is our highest court, has continued to function and also has rejected many of the claims by the president's lawyers, some of which border on, excuse me, my own personal opinion, absurdity, theater of the absurd, right? I don't know if you have theater of the absurd in India, but we certainly have it in England and America, but I bet you do. The great theater in India. But the point I'm trying to get at is it's absurd to claim that you won the election if you didn't, and then to bring lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits in the courts. But the Supreme Court has not fallen over. The Supreme Court quite very appropriately in the last case where Texas sued another state and said, Pennsylvania, you had problems in your state because you didn't do the proper thing. The court just in a short paragraph said, we're tossing this out. You don't have standing to sue. You can't sue. You have no injury. What happens in Texas is your concern. What happens in Pennsylvania is Pennsylvania's concern. Supreme Court's not going to get involved. And that decision included the 3 judges who were appointed by President Trump. Because President Trump thought he was going to appoint 3 judges, he's going to control the court. It didn't work like that. Although in the last decision, I think on immigration, on the census and so forth, there was a victory for President Trump. But what I'm trying to say is, on the fundamental issue of the institutions, they still continue to function, and the legal institutions continue to function. So perhaps the president and his campaign thought that maybe if we put judges on the court, they will do what we want and all of that. And that is the part of your theme that is very important, that the legal institutions should continue to function seamlessly through the COVID epidemic, so that we can come out of this and we can be proud of that result and say our legal institutions did function properly in this environment. It's a very difficult environment. Just as a practical matter, the Supreme Court, I don't think ever had a live feed. Never. I've had a couple of times I took students to the court and so forth, and you come to the court, they hear the oral argument, they take a transcript, and then they release an audio, never a video. So now they actually live stream the audio. That's a revolutionary development in the Supreme Court jurisprudence. It's actually quite fascinating. Well, I'm trying to say that they figured out a way to do it. They figured out a way to keep the courts functioning, the legal system functioned, our checks and balances functioned, our institutions functioned, and we still have one more step, which is on January 6th, when the joint session of Congress is going to count the electoral votes, and we have to see whether or not a House member and a Senate member are going to contest the election. I absolutely predict, as Mitch McConnell, and if you follow this, told the senators do not contest, because if you do, you start breaking down the institutions. It's a lot about commitment to institutions and not just to partisan advancement. And that is, we've had that challenge. We still have tremendous challenges, and each country is addressing these challenges and trying to figure out, can my institutions address these issues? Sometimes we do it better, sometimes we don't. But at the end of the day, we need to come out of this with I think with some satisfaction. Going back to the point about sovereignty, which I just mentioned, and it's very important to understand. I don't know how we fix that issue of sovereignty and how that is a challenge to the international legal order. It's a tremendous, tremendous problem. You have International Court of Justice, which is really not an international court of justice because it can't hear a case unless the parties have consented to it, or they have an agreement or a treaty which submits the case to the court. Now, a good example of the conundrum is on the law of the sea and on the Permanent Court of Arbitration in a case of Philippines against China. China didn't appear in the case, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration issued a 500-page opinion basically debunking every single claim that China made in terms of its international legal claims, basically claiming that you can take a rock and make it into an island and then you can get an exclusive economic zone, all of which is not based in international law, and using their historical claims and historical rights, which were extinguished when China entered the UN Convention on War of the Sea. So all of this was debunked. Then at the end of the day, when this was issued, then one of China's officials said this was a piece of trash paper. Now, if the Permanent Court of Arbitration, admittedly, China didn't appear, and China contested jurisdiction, which as lawyers, we respect, that's fine, contesting jurisdiction. But saying that it's a piece of trash paper is so, I don't know how to say it. It just basically casts off the whole idea that this tribunal has any validity. The International Court of Justice has some validity, but only if the parties submit the case. So therefore, it really can't decide any there's no binding jurisdiction over a case. It can't really issue an injunction as we do in a domestic court. an Indian court, the American court, the judge issues an order, you follow that order. I mean, it just have to. That's called the rule of law. In the case of the International Court of Justice, there is no compulsion. I'm not saying it should. You know, in the International Criminal Court, I'm sure they had very beneficent and very good ideas. The United States has never joined that court because, again, the fear of the imposition and interference with American sovereignty. Although America has always believed in the rule of law and international law. I guess I just have a few more minutes, and I don't know if there are any questions or thoughts that anybody has, but I'd be happy to. I'm looking at my clock, so I think I'm right about where I'm supposed to be, and I'm happy to continue or take questions or have a dialogue, because I've been talking for a long time, and I hope it was interesting and effective. I was talking to my screen. I was talking to Imran and to myself. I hope to someone else. Thank you. I don't hear you. You're muted.
Yes, sir. Imran sir must be having some network issues.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah. You're here.
All right.
Yeah.
So, thank you, sir, for your lovely presentation. And I think people who are here, if they wish, they can turn on their video so that sir can also see all of us.
Yeah,
Right.
why don't they everybody turn on their video? Avantika, turn on your video. I saw you. I thought you were going to talk to me. I thought you would say something. Arunika, talks to me. Say so. Ask me a question, a comment, a thought.
Sir, that was a lovely presentation. Like you talked about everything which has been bothering us, especially regarding the relevance of international bodies, which is primarily, you must have heard about our Prime Minister's statement regarding the relevance of UN. So it is quite ironical that the government of India, like I'll speak for India itself, like the government has not been able to provide even the basic amenities to the poorest of the people, like not even food packets, and they are blatantly blaming the international organizations. So it always bothered that you do not do your own duty, but you are here to blame the others. But at the same time, the international bodies have also shown no response or have not taken the entire matter very seriously. So it's like that, where do the common people go? Where do the poor people go? Especially in regions like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, these poor nations, where a majority of the population is just hand to mouth basis. Where do we go? Who is going to hear our grievances? That is the question on the top of our minds since the beginning of this pandemic. So thank you for addressing that, sir. And
Well,
if you want to add,
I wanted to mention Avantika, that you went off the video. I don't know. I went to talk to you. Okay, no problem.
I'm so sorry. I'm so
No
sorry.
problem. Yeah. I have this with my students too. I mean, they just turn off. I say, where are you? Anyway, but here's the thing. It's a very important point that you raise. And actually, the New York Times had an article on this, I think, in the last 2-3 days about India. And it was very interesting that what they said was that on the trains, that the government was going to impose rules and regulations on people who were traveling on the trains, because what happened is people wanted to flee the pandemic and got on these trains, and the government did not screen the people. This is a whole big article on the first page article in the New York Times. And of course, this is a small point of what you're saying. What I think the, I don't know that we're going to be able to, how we're going to solve that. As I think I mentioned, when you mentioned about blaming the international organizations, I mean, that to me, again, my personal opinion, that there's no validity in that. I mean, in other words, I mean, you look in the mirror and look at yourself. I mean, it seems to me that is what you should be doing, not blaming the international institutions, which, as I think we all agree, have not been effective for political reasons, because of being co-opted by national powers and seeing the international institutions as an element or as a part and parcel of national power advancement. That's not the purpose of these institutions, particularly the WHO. Right now, about taking care of the needs of the people, this is it's a problem that's globally a global problem, and particularly in the countries that you refer to. Accountability of the government. It's a tremendously problematic issue. And, India is a democracy. I mean, if you said to me, and I don't, again, it's almost a conundrum that it would make my head implode when you tell me that the people have no food to eat. We eat, and believe it or not, it's a fact that in America, the numbers of people who have food concerns is gigantic. I know this is maybe in the rest of the world, people don't realize it, but the numbers are staggering. Now that is inexcusable. If a government cannot provide for the basic needs of its people, then it shouldn't be in the government. Then you should have somebody else. I mean, it's very, very simple. Look, if my job, I'm the sanitation commissioner and I have to clean up the street or plow the snow, I don't know if you have snow, but we have snow just now, then if they can't do it, then find somebody else. And that's all. It's very, very simple. So, the question of accountability, national accountability, is a political, it's how we organize ourselves in society, and particularly in democracies. Sometimes democracies have a harder time relating in this way than authoritarian states. I mean, authoritarian state can say to you, I don't know if you've had lockdowns, but in China, they lock down, 25 million people. You can't leave your house, or you get a fine, arrested or something. In New York, in America, where I am, I mean, they have a lockdown, but people can keep driving and doing what they're doing. We kind of trust everybody. We had rules and regulations about travel where people who come to the airports are supposed to be checked, and there's a checklist. People come to some airports, there are checks. They come to some other airports, there are no checks. So all I'm trying to say is that, sometimes democracies have a harder time implementing rules that are necessary for the good of the people. And what we see particularly in America is a pushback, a revolt against these rules. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that people in a bar in Staten Island, right, we're having a deliberately maskless getting together in a crowd? Or the one I read about, which was, mind-boggling, a few hundred people got together to sing Christmas carols. Singing with no masks as a protest. Singing is the worst thing you can do in a group. So, and we see, of course, the whole Trump movement and America, that whole thing that's not going to stop either. So, again, Indian politics is so different than American politics. But similarly, people, again, the purpose of the government to serve the needs of the people. That's the idea. And government exists, at least in democracies, to serve the interests of the people. And if it can't do that, it doesn't function properly. But how do you fix it? Gee whiz, I think that's the next webinar, Imran. But I think Avantika's point is a great. It's a great point. But again, food insecurity is a worldwide problem, and it's a disaster. It's a shame. I mean, it's a shame. Where are the international institutions have fallen down completely? But the government should be accountable. But how do we regulate that? You can't. No government can come along and say, the American government, again, it's called, America is a little unique in the sense that America has on its State Department website, a listing of every other country and how they're doing in human rights. I don't know if any other country in the world that makes a checklist, a report card for everybody else, but that's America. So, again, I think that our world order is in turmoil. We live in a world in disarray. So our international institutions have fallen down terribly. And I think, by the way, Avantika, your point said which was bothering you. I think it started to bother a lot of people. I think this was a wake-up call, an epiphany for people to start to realize that these institutions have failed in their mission. And this was people woke up. It's almost, we have like this Rip Van Winkle story. I don't know if you have, children's stories from like that, but the person wakes up after 20 years and they say, oh my God, look how the world has changed. Well, we just woke up and we started waking up to realize the UN institutions don't function. In terms of China, and that's a whole other discussion, in terms of their actions in the world, people are starting to look around and seeing that, the rise of their offensive military capability and, picking fights with a country like India in the Galwan Valley. It seems bizarre, but it isn't. because it's part of a strategy to push India aside and to the concern. This has to be a fundamental concern for the United States. I do believe, though, that we will be able to get through it. Obviously, the problem that you talk about in terms of the problems of the people, I mean, that's the same problems in all national societies, and the demand of the people for services to be taken care of, to be helped in a pandemic. All these things are fundamental functions of what government does, particularly in democracy. But in a democracy, it's the rule of the people. So sometimes the people, hey, President Trump got elected, and I will never comment on Indian politics because I'm not an expert on it. But the point I'm trying to get at is the people, yes, the people. That's Robert Frost. So sometimes the people make good decisions. Sometimes the people make other decisions, but it's a democracy. And, that's really the question. By the way, it's interesting that I believe that, is it not, and the Supreme Court justices, I think, visited the Indian Supreme Court, if I'm not mistaken, including Justice Breyer. And I think they did. I mean, again, I'm a little vague on this, but I think they cited this is a whole debate between Justice Scalia and Justice Breyer, whether our jurisprudence should incorporate the jurisprudence of other countries. So kudos to the Indian legal system, Indian Supreme Court. But Justice Scalia said, don't do that, because he only wanted to use the Constitution. Arunika, anything from you? Yes. Oh, thank you. No, please.
Yes,
I'm happy to keep discussing.
I do have a question, sir. If it's not an issue, can I continue, Avantika?
Yeah, please.
Okay, sir. So first of all, I really enjoyed the last 30 minutes. I think I've learned a lot. And my question is actually coming from a place of despair. So a few days ago, I saw a video of a little child who was living in the war-torn country of Syria, and he was blaming the whole humanity for it. He said, each one of us will pay for the silence that we show when people like him and his brothers and sisters suffer. And when I put that or think about that in the context of pandemics, and how pandemics are actually a result somewhere of hyper globalization and hyper economic activities, which somewhere countries like China and USA and many European countries are also leading in. Where does the global South place itself in terms of finding relief from all this, if I may ask? I know it's a big question, but I do want to know that how people like us can start making a difference, obviously through research and being vocal about it, but also isn't it time for us to come out of the idea that UN is supposed to be approached only by countries and not individuals? Isn't it time that all of us come together and raise voice and approach some forum, so that where we can initiate dialogue that actually comes from people who are the worst affected by such conditions?
Well, I think, first of all, it's kind of this idea of R2P, and the idea of it's not just in terms of saving people from starvation, but it's also saving them from the situation in Syria, where you have, mass murder by the government, and the people obviously are suffering there. So there, in terms of, just to talk about Syria for a moment, that one is a heartbreaking conflict, because you do have the involvement of Russia, and with Russia's involvement and the United States involvement, and Iran being in Syria, which is one of Pompeo's points at the Heritage Foundation, that Iran should get out of Syria. I don't understand why Iran is only in Syria so it can get up close to Israel and have a war with Israel, which is not a valid reason. There have been intervention. So because of that international intervention, you are reliant on, you have a great power involvement, and the main concern is deconflicting the great powers. The point about the people and their access to international institutions is a very, very important point. What they're thinking about at the UN, what they were talking about at this webinar, is try to go a little bit below the level of states and try to involve NGOs. But I don't think that's sufficient. I agree with you. I think that there has to be more access to the UN by, even groups of people. In other words, and this idea of R2P, to have some sort of, which Richard House calls sovereignty 2.0, which is some way in which nations can get together and can help what you say, the global south, or help people in poverty and not have to rely and point the finger, you UN, or you food program, or you WHO, or you take care of it. There's no more, that's not efficacious. It doesn't really work. How you fix that is a very big conundrum. It's a big conundrum. It's a big problem. Now, the same problem exists even in democratic societies, if you think about it, because in a democratic society like the United States or India, the average person does not have access to influence in government. Let's be real, right? Who has access to influence in government? The elite. They do, right? In our country, in America, we have interest groups, and those interest groups have influence, and they can either be, and also individuals who are donors to campaigns and interest groups. They are the ones who have influence in politics. It's not the average person. The only people group that has some influence are large groups of people like the American Association of Retired Persons that get together to get insurance for older people, and disability and things like that. But other than that, the average person, the congressmen are not going to be attuned to them. They're attuned to getting donations so that they can be reelected, and they're attuned to interest groups who support their need to get reelected. That's how our system operates. I'm quite sure in a democracy like India, again, the elites are very influential and they have a lot of say, and the average person does not have a lot of say. And so that's number one. Number two, about the South and North, and this is a longstanding issue, of the haves and the have-nots in the world. I mean, if you look at the vaccine, I think that's a very good example of what you're talking about in terms of distribution of the vaccine. Because what they're saying was also a Times article that the vaccine distribution is going to be focused in a number of what would you say industrialized or powerful or rich countries, and the other countries are not going to have the same opportunity for the vaccine. I mean, this is a fact of life in international affairs. It really needs to change. But the question is, Arunika, how should we change it? Who is going to change it? Well, there has to be some kind of a groundswell of people to try to do it, even in their own societies or also internationally, but it's very, very difficult to do it. The way you'll end up doing it, honestly, I'm thinking it's kind of a very powerful question. If you think about, again, it will be corporations, it will be NGOs, and again, that's not optimal, but it is those corporations and NGOs and those institutions that are going to put pressure on the UN to do more on these issues. But a lot of it, as you say, economics and the global economic system dictates certain things and certain influences. So Canada, the US, Great Britain, these countries are getting the vaccine, and the other countries, they show this graph in the New York Times of the countries not getting it. It's the same exact issue that you're talking about. So I don't know the answer to it. R2P has been floated around. That's a very important issue. I think certainly to protect people from starvation and food insecurity is important, but also from mass murder and mass destruction, as has occurred in many of these countries with massacres of people. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is I think, very often it's the answer of unilateral action by other powers coming into these countries and trying to help the people when the government itself is not doing it, or the government is a failed government, it's a failed state, it doesn't function. I mean, to me, Syria is a failed state. I mean, there isn't a state that functions. It's a series of small domains. You have Assad's domain, a country when Russia supports it. US is in there. You have the Kurds, the Turks, the Iranians. That's a failed state. So who suffers? And that's the point, become people-centric. The people suffer. It's always the people who suffer, but they have no reliable way to challenge the bigger issues. But that's always been the case in world history, and fixing it is very important, and also sovereignty stands in the way. But if you didn't have sovereignty, then you would not have a system of any kind, because then the states around the world, as you surely appreciate, would never participate in any multilateral activities. So I don't know the answer to it, but it's a fantastic question. I hope what I said made sense. I tried. Did it make sense?
Definitely. I got a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much for such a detailed answer.
That was a very kind answer on your part and made my day. You made my day. Everybody, you made my
So
day.
did you, sir. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Sir, if you have time, I have just one quick question. If you're not getting late.
No, I'm good so far. A few more minutes. I have
Yeah.
teaching a class at
Yeah. So
9,
just
but I
one
have to
question.
prepare.
It is not necessarily related to COVID-19.
Hmm.
Actually, you mentioned that there are organizations, international organizations, in which all the parties have to vote for one thing. I mean, the decision
Yes.
is taken on the basis of consensus. Actually, last semester I did empirical research of the legal or personality of 45 international organizations.
Ah.
Yeah, so an interesting thing that I found that those organizations, especially related to third world countries like SARC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, then African Unity. So these are the third world organizations in which they don't have a provision on legal personality. Similarly, they don't have they follow the decision making process on the basis of consensus. Do you think that the consensus thing that they have in their charter, including SARC, we take decision on the basis of consensus. Do you think it shows the political weakness of the countries that don't have trust, like someone will do on the basis of majority of voting share? Like India may convince all the parties against Pakistan, so Pakistan might have fears. Similarly, India has fear that Pakistan may convince other parties to SARC to take some decision. Do you think that it has a lot to deal with the political weakness on the part of the countries?
So, I mean, another conundrum. The only way they can function is by consensus, and the reason is because nobody is going to agree, particularly in the situation, let's say India, Pakistan. No one will agree that I am going to allow the majority to rule against me, right? So the way you prevent that is to make sure it has to be unanimous, which doesn't function. But on the other hand, it does encourage the participation of that state in the organization, as you did your study, and you're much more in-depth understanding that. But look, the function of the OIC, for example, is they're not all of these organizations are there like NATO or OSCE or UN collective security. That's not their purpose. The purpose there is more kind of marshaling cooperation and connection and political power to project in the world. But again, if India is on a panel, now let me say about majority rule. I mean, our founding fathers were not crazy about pure majority rule. They didn't like it because, again, in a majority rule, you end up having the minority being necessarily not getting its voice heard, right? So as in these institutions, it's a protection. In other words, I want India to join, but Pakistan's also on this panel. Well, I'm not joining because if they vote against me, as you say, I don't accept it. Well, then it has to be consensus. So the weak part of it is that it requires consensus. The good part of it is that you get everybody to participate, and that you do get consensus on things like OSCE did get consensus on some activities in Ukraine, Crimea, and they do certain things. So they can squeeze out some things. Now, I was just thinking about your point about India and Pakistan. I mean, again, pure majority rule in theory, sounds very good, but it really isn't always good. This is why, for example, why in America we don't have a national popular vote, because the founding fathers wanted to insulate that. It's a whole long discussion for another webinar. But what I'm trying to say is that, but consensus itself at the end of the day makes these organizations not as effective. So it's kind of what we call a catch-22, in the sense that it's good to have everybody participating and sitting at the table. And that was the idea of the UN too. The UN also was formed to get everybody, truth of the matter is, at the UN in New York or in Geneva, whatever, The Hague, whatever organization, you have diplomats of different countries, and they're talking to each other and they're having coffee and tea, and you would walk by and see different, and that there's some value to that. Those side discussions, those track 2 discussions that people have at these meetings are very valuable. So having that institution and it's not just talk, having the chance to have delegates from different countries being able to talk to each other and hopefully to put aside their national predilections for 5 minutes and actually treat other people as human beings would be a very good thing, because they don't have a forum to do that. There'll be no other forum to do that. So that, if that's the purpose of it, not as a debating society, but as an opportunity to talk to each other and maybe find some common issues. And if a pandemic came, maybe in the future, God forbid, or some other challenge, that we can actually work together and put aside our nationalism. This is a tall order, and to address the points that Arunika referred to in terms of solving the world's problems, these glaring problems, inexcusable problems that tend to be overshadowed in most respects by national prerogatives. The Brazil, the rainforest, well, the government wants to advantage the people who want to exploit the rainforest for the resources. I mean, we see this all over the world. We're not going to be able to solve climate change by everybody doing it by themselves. Now, President Biden is going to promote that idea. So I think food insecurity should be up on the top. Basic needs of health and food should be the top issue. But the problem that you have, Arunika, is that the political sphere has invaded or permeated these spheres, where the concept at the UN was, we're going to create these institutions that are going to deal with these problems, health, food, and so forth, right? And that was the idea. Those would be pristine, and those would not be tainted by politics. But unfortunately, as we see, they're now tainted by politics, so they don't function in the way that they should function, right? So the solution to the problems of the world is not the Belt and Road Initiative. The problem is working together to provide aid to people and help them survive, and not have these national barriers and blocks to helping people. And I think people, the level of analysis of looking at people is very, very, very important. I agree with you, but the UN is not going to just, when I asked this question, the Undersecretary General, her answer to me was, let's make a change, but the change shouldn't be disruptive, which I understand to mean, we think we need to do something, but we're not doing it right away. We don't want to shake things up. Well, I think shaking it up is what they need to do. Shake it up, do something different, and try to look particularly to specialized agencies. And that was the point, Arunika, what you're referring to. Those specialized agencies could do a lot of good if they weren't, if the great powers like China were trying to go in and control them. There was an article in the Times about that, where China is in fact joining and taking over many of these institutions. Reason being, and this is also Russia and other great powers, that they want to make sure that they cannot be criticized and actions taken by those institutions against them. Well, that isn't the purpose of the founders of the United Nations. The purpose was collective security at its core, with specialized help in food and health and all kinds of other important issues would be in the perimeter and helping people. That got somewhat sidestepped. And even the peacekeeping function was marginal in some cases, marginally effective, as long as it didn't involve the conflict of the great powers. In Cyprus, you had the UNFICYP, and you have the UNIFIL in Lebanon, and so there's some functions, but again, not ones that would be optimal to us. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you so much, sir. And if there is any question, anyone has any question, because I think we are getting late also. That's
fine. Well, thank you very, very much for the privilege of doing this. I hope it was interesting and helpful, and it seemed to be. I learned a lot today from Arunika and Avantika. That was absolutely fantastic. And so that's about it. Thank you. Is there a recording of this? Will there be a recording of this segment?
Yeah, I will send you the link of YouTube, sir.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Now,
do you want my email? Shall I give you my email in the chat if you want to reach me?
Maybe some of the participants may ask, so it's better to give in the email. Yeah.